Good afternoon, and welcome to my presentation on the NAPRA Model Standards for Pharmacy Compounding of Non-Sterile Preparations. In 2017, the OCP has adopted these standards as the minimum requirement that must be met by all pharmacists and pharmacy technicians compounding non-sterile preparations. And the implementation of these guidelines is being rolled out in a three-phase process. Phase 1 being the assessment of risks and gaps, and that was set to be due on January 1st, 2020. Phase 2 being personnel training and quality assurance, which the majority of this presentation will focus on, and that's set to be completed by July 1st, 2021. And finally, Phase 3, facilities and equipment assessment, and that final phase is set for January 1st, 2022. So this presentation is just going to be a brief outline of all three of these phases, with the focus being on phase 2 and a little bit of background on phase 1. So let's get right into it. So the first part of phase 1 was the designation of a regulated pharmacy professional to be the non-sterile compounding supervisor. And on page 11 of the guidance document, it outlines in great detail the roles and responsibilities of this pharmacy member. But in essence, it's a pharmacist or pharmacy technician who develops, organizes, and oversees all activities related to the compounding of non-sterile preparations, and has such roles and responsibilities as master formulation, record development, and risk assessment, developing policies and procedures, training staff, and ensuring that all personnel fully comply with said policies and procedures. The next major step of phase 1 was to evaluate the pharmacy's current and anticipated compounding services and preparations to assess the risk and determine the level of requirements to be implemented in preparing these compounds. So on page 7 of the guidance document, it shows many of the factors to consider in the risk assessment, which include the complexity of the compounding, need for verification and uninterrupted workflow, frequency of compounding high risk or low risk preparations, concentration of ingredients, quantity of ingredients, physical characteristics, type of hazardous drug, so on and so forth. So that page goes into detail. And the next page, page 8, outlines a decision algorithm to assess the risk of each compound prepared. So this is a lengthy process that must be ensured for each preparation the pharmacy is intending to make. And at the end of the day, it'll be grouped into 3 different categories of risk. Level A, which means that the compound must be prepared in a designated and separate compounding area, this level being the least restrictive. Then we have level B, where the compound must be prepared in a separate room, ventilated, or with a containment device. And then finally, level C, where the compound must be prepared in a separate room under negative pressure with the containment device. Now, the algorithm is fairly straightforward, but there are a few points that I think require some clarification. For example, there are a few key references that you must have on hand in order to go through this algorithm. For example, you're going to need a copy of the NIOSH list, which is basically a list of hazardous drugs, as well as the safety data sheet for a lot of the ingredients here, which reference the Hazardous Product Act, which is mentioned multiple times in the guideline here. The safety data sheets are also key in identifying if ventilation is needed and what PPE is needed to prepare the compound. It's also useful to have a copy of the USP chapter on general compounding to identify the difference between simple, complex, and moderate compounds, as mentioned in the algorithm. And finally, another important part of the algorithm is deciding on what an occasional small quantity really means. And this can be quite ambiguous. And as far as I was able to find, it's defined by the pharmacist, and the pharmacist has to be able to defend whatever they choose as a small occasional quantity. Again, very ambiguous based on this guideline, but still an important part of the whole risk assessment here. So I think the best way to get a handle on this is to do an example. So let's talk about diclofenac powder and PLO gel. So as we can see here, the first step is to check the NIOSH list, table 1. And as we can see here, diclofenac is not part of table 1 of the list. It's not a cytotoxic drug. So then we just keep going down the algorithm here. It is in table 2 or 3 of the NIOSH drug list. So that brings us to the right-hand side of the algorithm now. And the NEOSH or WMIS information, and by WMIS information, I mean the safety data sheets that we mentioned earlier on. It does indicate that that this material requires ventilation for preparation. So because of that, we go further to the right on the algorithm. And let's say for argument's sake, we're making an occasional small quantity. Then that takes us to the bottom here. And whether or not the ingredients require greater precautions to protect the patient or the personnel. And the answer is yes. And the safety data sheet will go through the PPE required to prepare. So that takes us down to level B, meaning that the PLO diclofenac compound must be compounded in a separate room, ventilated, or with a containment device. And of course, this is gonna have drastic consequences on, the layout of the pharmacy. And this seemingly simple compound is now going to be ruled out in many different pharmacies. So just a good example of how these guidelines are really going to be impacting us as a profession. And then, of course, the final step of phase 1 was to take all of this into consideration and use the results of the risk assessment and taking into account the frequency and quantity of compounding and risk mitigation measures, and complete a gap analysis to compare the pharmacy's current practices to the minimum standards. So this was all phase 1. This was all due January 1st, 2020. And now we're going to be moving on to phase 2, which should be the next focus in our preparation to implement these guidelines, and the main focus of this presentation. And phase 2 is really all about setting the policies and procedures to maintain the standards in the guideline, including personnel training and a quality assurance program, which is also very important. So definitely a huge chunk of the planning to implement these guidelines is contained in phase 2. And although the deadline has been extended to July 1st, 2021, there really is a lot to do for this phase. So it's best to get started now rather than worrying about it later. So the first step is obviously to train all staff and personnel. And that includes not only the pharmacists and registered pharmacy technicians, but also the non-regulated staff, most notably the pharmacy assistants, who, although will be carrying out more technical tasks in comparison to the pharmacist and pharmacy technician, they're still an extremely important part of the team. And let's not forget, in reality, in most community pharmacies, a lot of these preparations are going to be made by the pharmacy assistants. So it's important to get just proper training throughout the board. And Chapter 5 of the guideline goes through all the roles and responsibilities of each member of the team. And it's a little bit too long to go in depth here. But then those roles and responsibilities are then translated into a training program that covers all of the main elements. And then, as you can see here in Table 1, there's about 20 elements of the training program that should be implemented. And it goes through which members of the team should be focused on in each of these training programs. For example, we see here that both the pharmacist and pharmacy technician must be trained on how to develop the master formula, determine the beyond of use date, and perform a risk assessment. But the non-regulated pharmacy staff aren't responsible for that. But most of these training elements do overlap, as you can see here, where the non-regulated staff aren't supposed to be trained on the legislation behind everything, the physical and chemical properties of the compounds, and being able to recognize errors in the compounding technique of personnel. Again, the assistants aren't going to be checking these compounds, but the pharmacist and regulated pharmacy technician should definitely know and have a good command on all of this. Another interesting element is that all of the staff members are expected to have a good command on pharmaceutical calculations and understand other technical things such as pharmaceutical and medical abbreviations. So it's fairly comprehensive, and it's definitely going to take a lot of work. Whereas the current structure we have in community pharmacy is kind of a learn as you go approach, and obviously for these new guidelines, that isn't going to cut it anymore. So we do have to start working on a training program for all the personnel involved. And again, Chapter 5 goes through a few of the compounding of hazardous non-sterile preparations. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. So we're just going to be focusing on the non-hazardous presentations. And then obviously after the training program is implemented, we have to have a way of assessing the skills of the personnel. So Chapter 5 also has this pretty comprehensive checklist for compliance. And it goes through each and every step and what's expected at each stage of the compounding process. So just to quickly run through it, step 1 is to consider whether the compounded preparation prescribed is appropriate and safe for the patient, and that would be conducted by the pharmacist. And step 2 would be determine whether a valid formula exists, and if not, the pharmacist would have to develop a master formula, consulting experts or reliable sources, such as the USP, and then ensure that this master formula includes instructions for special handling. Then the pharmacist or pharmacy technician would be expected to calculate and verify the quantities of each ingredient required on the compounding record. The next step would be to ensure that the personnel responsible for compounding are wearing the appropriate PPE, such as mask, gloves, cap, and a clean laboratory coat or disposable gown. Next, the preparation, if it has a hazardous product, we would have to ensure that additional PPE are appropriate, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation. Next, we would ensure that only one preparation is being compounded at a time, and then the person would gather the ingredients and necessary equipment and ensure that the equipment is ready for use, being that it's clean and in good repair. Then each ingredient will be measured using the appropriate equipment, and then an independent check would confirm each ingredient and its quantity with the compounding record before the preparation is compounded. So this is a big difference here. Usually the pharmacist doesn't check the compound until the end, but under these new standards, the pharmacist would have to independently verify that each ingredient and its quantity is correct before the technician or assistant compounds it. Then we would have to ensure that the compounding of the preparation is in line with the master formulation record. Then we would just have to check the labeling, make sure it complies with requirements of provincial and territorial pharmacy regulatory authority. That includes the beyond use date, storage information if needed, and all active ingredients and the concentration of each are identified on the label. Then through an independent check, the appearance of the final preparation, the color, clarity, odor, etc., have to be checked. Usually that would be the pharmacist checking or the pharmacy technician. And then we would have to ensure that the area and equipment are cleaned immediately after use, according to the manufacturer's standards, and then ensure that the ingredients or equipment are put away immediately after use. So yeah, a very comprehensive list here, and this is the checklist that should be used when assessing the compounder's skills and knowledge. All right, moving on to the next requirement for phase 2, the development and implementation of policies and procedures. And I'm pretty sure that this is the longest and most time-consuming part of stage 2. It requires the non-sterile supervisor to ensure the application and compliance of established policies and procedures. And these are written policies and procedures, so we're actually going to have a record of a lot of these. And the guideline does provide a template for developing a procedure and documenting it, which is fairly comprehensive, but it also includes a list of different policies and procedures that should be implemented. For example, there should be a bunch of personnel and facilities procedures. For example, attire and dress code procedures, initial training and assessment program procedures, so on and so forth. It goes through the list on page number 17 of the guidelines. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of procedures regarding the actual compounding. For example, like hand hygiene, determining beyond of use dates, packaging, final preparations, etc., and the template goes through how to document these procedures. So it would have to have the pharmacy name, the procedure number, approved date, effective date, and these procedures should be revised about every 3 years, reviewed and revised, that is. And so very, very detailed process here. Should have the title of the procedure, the aim and objective of the procedure, the target personnel, required facilities, equipment and material, more references, procedure history. The template goes through all that. I'm not going to get into it right now, but a very detailed process. And according to the list here, there are I'd say at least about like 25 different procedures that they're expecting us to to document. So a lot of work there. So it just highlights the importance of starting this sooner rather than later. And the next major step of phase two is to develop a quality assurance program. And this is really important because it allows us to generate information showing that the organization's personnel, facilities, and equipment are attaining and maintaining the conditions required for these high quality non-sterile preparations. And it allows us to get trends and acquire data that allow us to use corrective action and preventative action if necessary. So the quality assurance program is going to differ depending on the pharmacy's level of requirements, being level A, B, or C. And the guideline here goes through the major subcategories of the quality assurance program. For example, facilities, equipment, personnel, final compound, and documentation. And it goes through examples of a lot of these different quality assurance measures. So, for example, looking at facilities, for example, if we look at the facilities part of things, we see that the verification of the compounding area for level A requirements, being that it's clean, orderly, in a good state of repair, has appropriate storage space and space for actual compounding. That should be reviewed at least every 6 months when the compounding area is installed, when new equipment is installed, and whenever anything in the area is repaired or maintained, or when a contamination problem is identified. So it just gives a time frame of how often to review the area, make sure that everything is going according to the standards, and then verification of daily temperature and humidity readings are documented in these areas, and that should be reviewed monthly according to the guideline here. Then we have the equipment side of things, again with temperature verification, um, verify logs monthly more often if problems are identified, calibrate temperature probes yearly, etc., etc. So it goes through all these different quality assurance steps in great detail. Looking at the personnel side of things, the skills assessment should be at initial qualification and periodically to ensure compliance with policies and procedures, or after extended leave from the pharmacy when an incident or accident happens. So this goes beyond the initial training program and skills assessment. This ensures that all personnel are constantly reviewing the guidelines and the expectations here. Then there's a few documentation quality assurance programs where current references and safety data sheets should be checked yearly. Compounding records should be checked quarterly, and policies and procedures should be reviewed every 3 years. In addition, the master formulation records should be reviewed yearly or when new information becomes available, and verification that documentation of all the procedures, the compounder's initials and entry in logs is being carried out, and that could be done quarterly in a quarterly review of the documentation. So again, Chapter 7 is pretty comprehensive on that. So let's move on to the next requirement. And then finally, building on the risk assessment in phase 1, a master formulation record for each preparation has to be filled out and must include all the necessary information for compounding the preparation. And Chapter 6 goes through all of the different requirements. So let's just go through that. Let's just go through that briefly. So the master formulation record for a compound has to include the official or assigned name, strength, and dosage form of the preparation, the expected yield, the sample calculations needed to determine and verify quantities of ingredients and doses for the quantity produced, a description of all ingredients along with their quantities, sources, and lot numbers, if applicable, compatibility and stability data, including all the references, the USP, etc., etc., and then any other references used to develop the formula, and the consultation date, as well as all the equipment needed to compound the preparation, including cleaning instructions. So very, very comprehensive. Special precautions, including PPE, the source of origin of the formula, mixing instructions. So that includes like the order of mixing, the mixing temperatures, the duration of mixing, and then other factors involved in the preparation of the compound. So pretty much a detailed recipe there. And then labeling information. So we have to have the B on use date, the BUD, storage conditions, prescription number, so the type of container used in dispensing, packaging, storage requirements, description of final preparation, and then quality control procedures and expected results. And Chapter 6 goes through a detailed template for the master formulation record. So a lot of work involved there, and uh, and again, that must be revised according to the quality assurance program. And just speaking a little bit more about beyond use dates, if there's an absence of any stability data for a drug or specific preparation, they provide a table in Chapter 6 that goes through the maximum beyond use dates for non-sterile compounds. Again, I just want to stress that this is only in the absence of specific information in the USP or any other reliable pharmacopoeia. But it goes through the different BUDs by type of formulation. For example, non-aqueous formulations has a beyond use date that is not later than the earliest expiry date of any of the individual active ingredients, or 6 months. So whichever is earlier between those two. Then any water-containing oral formulations has a beyond use date no later than 14 days when controlled at cold temperatures. And finally, water-containing topical or dermal, mucosal liquid, and semi-solids have a beyond use date that is no later than 30 days. So again, these are the these are the maximum beyond use dates in the absence of any other information. So that pretty much wraps up phase number 2. Just moving briefly on to phase number 3, where again the deadline is January 1st, 2022. And this phase here really focuses on ensuring that the facility and equipment required is in compliance with the standards. And that means we have to establish protocols and schedules for the cleaning and maintenance of the compounding area facilities and the equipment to maintain the quality and integrity. And of course, document these activities in a general maintenance log. So just briefly going through the standards here, with the focus being on level A requirements, which I think most community pharmacies are going to be mostly dealing with here. So there's a few general principles that should be followed with the facility for non-sterile compounding. First of all, it has to be performed in a separate space specifically designated for the compounding of prescriptions. And it really has to be out of the way, really in an area of the pharmacy with low traffic. And the space must be large enough for the personnel to work comfortably and safely, with room to store equipment and products and to prevent any contamination to these products. So those are a few of the general guidelines for the facilities. It goes on to describe some lighting requirements as well. The lighting fixture should be located to provide a well-lit area to help facilitate the compounding process and allow the verification. Goes through the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system as well, where that the heating and ventilation must be controlled to avoid any decomposition and contamination of chemicals, and maintain the quality of the stored products there. So appropriate temperature and humidity monitoring should be performed and required for certain ingredients in compounded dosage forms. And if any, air vents should not be located directly over the work areas. Clean water supply with hot and cold water must be available in or close to the compounding area. So I think our pharmacy meets that requirement right now. And there should be a sink nearby with hot and cold running water, preferably made of stainless steel according to these guidelines. So really specific here. And the plumbing system should be well maintained. Purified water should be used for compounding non-sterile preparations. So that's a no-brainer there. And purified water may be used for rinsing of the equipment and instruments. It does say may be used, so I don't know. It doesn't seem like that's a major stipulation here. As well as a few guidelines surrounding the work surfaces, furniture, and walls. They should be constructed of smooth, impervious, and non-porous materials according to the guideline, preferably stainless steel. And any material used for the work surface should be able to withstand repeated cleaning and disinfecting. And speaking of cleaning, there's a few guidelines surrounding that as well. A cleaning schedule should be appropriate to the level and type of non-sterile compounding. So I guess that will be up to the pharmacist's discretion there. And the worktop surface used for the compounding should be cleaned before and after each session. The sink should be thoroughly cleaned with detergent before and after compounding instruments and accessories are washed in it at least once a day. So quite strict with the cleaning here. Then next on the guideline, we have a few regulations regarding the equipment for non-sterile compounding. So routine maintenance should be carried to make sure that all the equipment is precise and reliable. And that means calibrating it at regular intervals recommended by the manufacturer, or at least once a year if there's no manufacturer recommendations. And then all of this should be documented in a maintenance form, including the person doing this maintenance. And then cleaning equipment, instruments, and accessories. So all cleaning work recommended by the manufacturer must be noted in the maintenance log. That's important. And equipments, instruments, and accessories used for several different preparations must be completely and thoroughly cleaned after each compounding session to really remove all traces of any previous product and any remaining water, solvent, all to prevent cross-contamination. And yeah, this is a much stricter stipulation compared to what we have in place now, where we usually just spray some isopropyl alcohol and wash it off. And it specifically says in the guideline that it is not sufficient to use only isopropyl alcohol, 70% as a cleaning agent. We also have to use purified water, which is definitely much stricter than the current practices that most pharmacies have in place. So that's definitely going to take some getting used to. And last but not least, all this information must be kept in a general maintenance log, and that should include the dates of cleaning or calibration and the names of all personnel responsible. So that's really phase three in a nutshell, is just trying to get all the facilities, all the equipment, and all the cleaning procedures up to date with the recommended guidelines. And again, for pharmacies that are going to be making level B and level C compounds, there's a lot more to get into, obviously, with the ventilation. And, obviously in those pharmacies, you'd have to have a separate room to compound. So I'm not going to get into that here. I don't really think it's applicable to most community pharmacies. So I'll just leave it at that. And, hopefully throughout the next few months, we could start developing the education and quality assurance programs. And then probably towards the middle of 2021 and onward, we'll really start looking towards getting our facilities ready for all these changes. So in conclusion, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And definitely go on the OCP website, where it has a bunch of documents, including the guidelines, but also a few other documents that might be helpful in meeting these requirements. So thank you very much, and take care.